Okay, so here we are at the third and final recording of the colonial period material. I hope everybody's doing really, really well, and I hope if you're having any questions or concerns that you get in touch with me and let me know those so that I can give you feedback and get you back on the right path. When we finished up in our last two recordings, we talked about sort of a comparison and contrast of Virginia, specifically the Jamestown colony, and New England, specifically the Plymouth colony, as examples that will kind of point towards longer-term differences, longer-term evolutions between the northern and southern colonies and ultimately the northern and southern states. Because nothing in history happens in a vacuum, everything in history is the result of things that come before it, it's really important as we're pointing in the direction of the end of the course, which is the Civil War. It's really important to understand why the Civil War happens and what it's really all about, right? Because if we just did a class about the Civil War, we would still have to lay a foundation for that so that it's clear exactly where it comes from. So in the 1600s, early 1700s, there are colonies scattered along the East Coast that are all part of the British Empire as a whole. And this is going to, as you hopefully know, be the central point of division that is the American Revolution, right? The colonies wanting to break away from the British Empire and ultimately form their own country. So what was the nature of that existence before the Revolution? Well, as I said, the colonies overall are seen by the British government as a mercantilist venture. What that means is the British government establishes colonial control, right, royal control or oversight of the colonies, specifically to try to maintain a positive trade relationship, to get natural materials, raw materials, natural resources out of the colonies, and make use of those materials to create finished products or to sell those materials to other countries. The home country, in this case England, will always be the one at the top of the pyramid. And so, yes, individual colonies might have certain self-control and certain self-government, but ultimately it is Parliament and the King in London who have the power to oversee and operate and define the operation of the colonies themselves. So a good example would be a series of laws that are passed between 1660 and 1673. Now, those are the years during which the laws are being created, not just the years in which they are active, right? So the Navigation Acts stretch all the way through the 1700s. They don't stop in 1673. That's just the last year that any of these laws is passed. And they do a number of different things to guarantee that the economy of the colonies is really controlled and overseen by the British government. So individual colonies can only trade using ships that are registered to England. So if I'm in Newport, Rhode Island, and maybe I make rocking chairs, right? I can't send my rocking chairs anywhere, whether it's to another American colony or whether it's to any place else on the planet. I can't send my rocking chairs on a ship that is not an English vessel. All of my goods have to pass through English customs. That means that if I am contracted to send my rocking chairs to Spain, I can't just put my rocking chairs on an English ship in Newport and ship it directly to Spain. It has to go through an English port first. So it has to go through London or Plymouth or Portsmouth or Southampton or Liverpool or any number of different English port cities. There, the English government will collect taxes, customs taxes, and will guarantee that they are making their tax revenue off of those products. By similar kinds of rules, let's say I want to send some of my rocking chairs out of Newport, Rhode Island, and I'm selling them to someone in Charleston, South Carolina. Still has to be shipped on an English vessel, but in this case, it doesn't have to go all the way through England. It just has to be collected, taxes have to be collected in Newport when I send it out, and in Charleston, South Carolina when it's being received. So here again, the idea is that England will collect its tax revenue, its share of taxes, for every transaction that's happening. Because the colonies exist as a supply of natural resources, as a potential marketplace for England to sell its goods, and also as a source of tax revenue for the British government. That's the nature of the mercantilist system, right? The colonies are there to benefit the home country. Sometimes things can trickle down to the colonies as a result, and in some respects, the American colonies, they do pretty well in that regard. But by and large, the both sides of the equation, both the colonists and the British, understand that that's the reality of the relationship that exists. And that's the relationship that is going to fracture leading up to the American Revolution. Things start to happen internally in England in the 1680s. Here again, we won't go into a lot of the background of it. Basically, there is a transition in the monarchy in England in 1688 called the Glorious Revolution. And the upshot of that for the colonists is that the new government, the new king and queen, William and Mary, decide to focus internally a little bit more. And so what that means for the colonists is it's more of a hands-off approach, right? They say, you know what? You guys have your own royal governors. You guys have your own colonial assemblies. Why don't you go ahead and run your own affairs while we try to get our ship in order at home? This lasts for about 50 years or so, right? That's what CA means, right? That's historian speak for circa. It just means approximately, roundabout. Basically what this means is not that the colonies are independent. It doesn't mean that the colonies want independence. What it does mean is the colonies start to say, okay, we really have to make our own decisions about our own affairs. We have to perfect the ability to govern ourselves, to regulate our internal economies. To some extent, some of those taxes that England had been placing on the colonies up to this point start to be relaxed a little bit. And so the colonies are starting to learn this kind of self-reliance, this kind of self-government. And what's more, this is lasting for a couple generations, right? So you have decade after decade after decade of Americans that are experiencing this kind of relationship with England. If this had only lasted for 2 or 3 years, those kinds of new ideas among the American population wouldn't have really taken root in the same way that they do, since this does last for 50 or 60 years. But again, we'll come back to this. It's not to suggest that the colonists are excited about the prospect of being separated from the British Empire. This is not a case where the colonists are even thinking in those terms, right? It just means that the colonists are beginning to have more of that self-control, that self-government, and that is going to be a factor when things start to change in the 1760s and 1770s. So, what other kinds of things are happening? As conditions in England start to improve, you see fewer and fewer people traveling to America, especially in terms of indentured servants or that kind of thing, right? More and more in the late 16 and early 1700s, the people who are coming to America are largely self-reliant people who are coming specifically to create their own shops, to create their own businesses, to start their own farms, and so on. The economy starts to get much more diverse, especially in the northern colonies, because you have more and more people bringing more and more skills, coming in to do more and more different things. And so the southern colonies increasingly start to kind of double down on cash crops as the centerpiece of their economy. And this then is going to lead directly to the solidification of slavery as the labor system of choice. The religious enthusiasm or the religious kind of framework that a lot of northern colonies are built around in one way or another tends not to be repeated in the South. That's not to say that religion is unimportant. It's not. It is a very important part of the American experience during the colonial period. But by and large, northern colonies maintain a closer relationship between faith and government than we see in southern colonies. The standard of living, then, generally speaking, is going to be higher in northern colonies than in southern colonies. Whether you're looking at things that are kind of out of the control of the settlers, things like disease. Northern colonies don't experience the same kinds of borderline tropical diseases that we see in the Chesapeake or in the Carolinas. The reproductive rate, the diet, the financial and sort of commercial standard of living tends to be higher in the North, partially because of the diversified economy, partially because of a larger population, partially because of different climate and different sort of environmental factors. And so you start to see the growth of the population of northern colonies at a much more rapid rate than the growth of the population of southern colonies. In fact, one of the main sources of population growth in the southern colonies is the importation of more enslaved people. And so the southern colonies start to have an imbalanced population between the whites who have political and social and economic power and the non-whites who don't. Early slavery is a little bit different than the way we might immediately imagine slavery to be. So when we think of slavery, we imagine a very particular kind of an experience that is the result of, the way we're taught, the way it's portrayed in popular media, that kind of thing. A very violent, very destructive, very power-based relationship. That is the slave system that begins to take root in the kind of early to mid 1700s. The initial slave system, while it's not an enjoyable thing by any stretch of the imagination, it is somewhat less violent than the way it will become later. And partially this is because of the numbers involved, right? Again, until the 1700s, you're not talking about large plantations with hundreds or thousands of enslaved people working on them. The economics of the situation mean that the slave owner and the enslaved person both will have some kind of say, some kind of vested interest in the operation of the system. And what's known as manumission, or emancipation, right? The decision to free an enslaved person. Those things are more common during what's known as the charter generation of slavery, right? The first 50 years or so of slavery in the American colonies. Again, this is not in any way to suggest that enslavement during that time period was more okay than enslavement during any other time period. But it's important to keep in mind that, like everything in history, slavery undergoes a period of transition, right? It undergoes an evolution over time. Nothing in history can be looked at as static, that you can just say, well, such and such was like that, and it was always like that, and it will always be like that. If history teaches us anything, it's that there are changes over time. We can see parallels, we can see similarities, but there is always change over time. As the 1700s wear on, there are a number of different factors, way more complicated than we have time to go into, that will combine to make slavery much more a power relationship, much more of the type of slavery that we would imagine, with very repressive and oppressive kinds of policies designed to enforce and protect a racial hierarchy of white supremacy. So we'll get into those kinds of things later in the class as we return to slavery a number of times, throughout our course. But that's going to be the end of the colonial period lecture material. We will start in the next section by jumping forward just a little bit closer to the 1730s, 1740s, and 50s, when we talk about America at the dawn of what's known as the French and Indian War, because that is really, in a lot of ways, going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, as it were, kind of leading to the tensions surrounding the American Revolution. So that's where we'll be going next. Let me know if you've got questions about any of this, and I will talk to everybody soon.